Hi, I'm Stephen Hrotic. I'm an anthropologist, and one of my focuses has been on academic culture. For example, I've written about how different disciplines constitute tribes, each with their own culture. But today I'm focused on interdisciplinarity. Anthropology has always been multidisciplinary, my work especially. For example, my background is in the cognitive science of religion. But how we be interdisciplinary is poorly understood. For example, research today have a large and growing number of terms we use: interdisciplinarity, multidisciplinarity, transdisciplinary, postdisciplinary, etc., that do not yet have commonly understood meanings. But I worry that such concerns are only addressed at the postgraduate level. I'm constantly looking for ways to get students to think about interdisciplinarity early on in their careers. I think this is important for at least two reasons. First, as Bill Payton pointed out, disciplines are like interpretive lenses. They determine what we can see and what we'll be blind to. We might miss, for example, similar work in another field called by another name. In my own field, for example, situated cognition and extended mind have a lot of overlap. But if we're not conscious of those possibilities, there's a lot we might miss. Also, any practical problem rarely falls neatly inside a single set of theories and methods. For example, Lynn Brooke and David Phillips, writing in an economic paradigm, brought together a number of disciplinary specialists to better understand how creativity can be encouraged and developed. So what I'd like to do today is briefly share three different models of interdisciplinarity, the last of which I think is the most versatile. But the first is the most conceptually simple. Entomologist E.O. Wilson is respected for his work on the social behavior among insects and infamous for his suggestion that the same rules might explain the behavior of humans. But he also developed the idea of consilience. Briefly, his idea is that different disciplines might be interested in different questions and may answer them using different theories and methods. But they're all concerned with the same causal universe. That is, we're all trying to understand the same reality. For Wilson, then, the difference between disciplines is largely a matter of scale. Biologists look at a larger piece of the puzzle than chemists, but smaller pieces than anthropologists. One scale might be better suited to solving a particular problem, but when they overlap, disciplines should agree. If biology, psychology, and anthropology all make contradictory predictions about how humans will behave, this alerts us to a part of the world in which we need to work a little harder to understand. The second model is perhaps the most specialized, but I've found it helps to expand the range of the types of explanations we would consider. This is Timbergen's four questions. In short, if a species displays a specific trait, there are four strategies for explaining why. We could look at the function of a trait, for example. If a trait has been selected for, was it an adaptation? Does it provide some selective advantage in a moment? Or we could look at long-term patterns of change, the phylogeny of a trait. What does this trait tell us about the history of a species compared to the history of another? Next, we could look at proximate explanations like causation. What specifically triggered a reaction, for example? Or we look at the changes in causation over the course of a life cycle, that is, the development or the ontology of a trait. To show how Timbergen encourages us to think broadly, consider the multiple ways we could explain why sugar is sweet. We could look at the specific causation. What specific chemicals prompt our brains to react in a particular pleasurable way? Or we could look at the adaptive function. Why is it that our brains evolved in such a way to reward us for consuming sugar-rich foods? Or we could ask why, over the course of our lifespan, preferences for different tastes change. Now, when I'm trying to use these two models to get students to think in an interdisciplinary way, or when I'm trying to explain a specific research project to colleagues, these two models each have advantages and disadvantages. Wilson's Conciliance has the advantage of being simpler to explain. It's easy to understand where disciplines fit in with each other and emphasizes not just the compatibility of disciplines, but translating between them. However, it doesn't really challenge our assumptions about how one tackles a particular problem. Timbergen's questions certainly encourage us to think in new ways, but it's difficult to see where many disciplines fit in his model. Take literature, for example. This is why I think the next model is a bit more useful both professionally and in the classroom. It combines both Wilson's sense of scale and Timbergen's ideas about different conceptual approaches. David Wilson's book, Indigenous South Americans of the Past and Present, surveys a number of distinct cultures and, naturally enough, seeks to understand what distinguishes them and why they're different. Wilson builds on previous conceptual models such as Marvin Harris's cultural materialism, with its familiar divisions between infrastructure, structure, and the superstructure of a society, and an emphasis on bottom-up explanations. He also draws from Roy Rappaport's more ecological top-down conceptualizations. The result is a rather elegant synthesis that he just labels as both a systems and a hierarchical model of human adaptive systems. One important feature of Wilson's model is that it emphasizes change in a system. Policy is, by definition, a change in ideology and/or leadership, which in turn and by sequence affects the structure and then the infrastructure of a society. Output then is the complement. Changes in the infrastructure naturally affect structure. For example, changes in the strategies people use to produce food inevitably affect domestic economy and social organization, which may then affect concepts of leadership. I like Wilson's model, but I think a few small changes make it a little more useful. First, changing the term policy to idealist removes, I think, a bias towards centralized authority and expands the top-down approach to include decentralized norms and beliefs. Second, changing output to materialist shifts the bottom-up approach further down. Wilson considers the impact of environment on a culture, but primarily as a constraint, not of direct influence. Third, below the current environment, we can add ancestral environments, the selections and pressures that created the human minds that produce all of human culture. Taken together, the emphasis is on interrelationships between scales of the phenomenon, between levels of analysis, and between disciplinary lenses. Borrowing a term from quantum mechanics, I've labeled this work in progress entanglement theory. To show you how I've used this kind of approach, I'll give you two examples, one from my teaching and one from my research. First, when I teach history of religion, one of the students' biggest challenges is letting go of the assumption that religion is really about philosophy or theology. One way I found to do this is to show them Wilson's diagram and ask them to circle the parts of the chart that can be used to describe religion. Almost everybody circles the superstructure, very few circle anything else. Then over the next class or two, we work our way down, actively describing religion first as an ideology and then as patterns of authority and leadership. We then move on to active parts of the economy and as a strong influence on questions at the infrastructure level. How and where do people live? How are families defined and organized? Finally, we ask, how is religion a product of the evolved human mind? Finally, I'd like to describe briefly an NSF proposal I was helping to write at the University of North Texas. It concerned fighting pollution in the Yamuna River in northern India. On one hand, this was an environmental issue. Pollution, especially in the form of improper sewage treatment and agriculture runoff, was a significant health concern. But this was also a religious issue. The Yamuna wasn't just a water source, she was literally a goddess. The source of the Yamuna, high in the Himalayas, was and is sacred, and it remains a major pilgrimage destination. So here's the conflict. By the time the Yamuna reaches the city of New Delhi, the dissolved oxygen content of the water is literally zero. The river is biologically dead. This was reflected and acknowledged at the level of belief and ideology. It was understood that somewhere upstream of New Delhi, a goddess died. Our goal here was to encourage those attempting to solve the environmental problem to engage in all levels of northern Indian culture, not just the environment and infrastructure problems like fertilizer runoff and anaerobic sewage treatments, but also things like the domestic economy, by inviting farmers to see themselves as stakeholders in this situation, as well as ideological and religious beliefs as ways to reshape not just the treatment of a river, but the structure of a society. In conclusion, I'd like to state that my goal here is to enthusiastically encourage everyone, students, researchers, professors, to take a moment to critique the idea of an academic discipline. Is it an academic department? Is it a set of theories and methods? Is it a way of looking at the world? Or is it a distinctive culture? I'd argue that disciplines are all of these, and that this realization isn't just esoteric trivia. It can be a way we contextualize any theory, conceptualize any problem. Hopefully one of these models will serve as a new interpretive lens for you, a panoramic view of the world we're all trying to understand. Thank you for listening.